Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wajenberg. This time we will continue our reading of The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton. Our hero, the man who was Thursday, Mr. Gabriel Syme, is a police agent working against the anarchists, and so far he has discovered 3 other agents on the anarchist committee who are also policemen working against the anarchists committee. The most recent one is Dr. Bull. Their new ally was in practical matters a whirlwind. At the inquiry office, he asked with businesslike brevity about the trains for Dover. Having got his information, he bundled the company into a cab and put them and himself inside a railway carriage before they had properly realized the breathless process. They were already on the Calais boat before conversation flowed freely. "I have already arranged," he explained, "to go to France for my lunch, but I'm delighted to have someone to lunch with me. You see, I had to send that beast the Marquis over with his bomb because the President had his eye on me, though God knows how. I'll tell you the story some day. It was perfectly choking. Whenever I tried to slip out of it, I saw the President somewhere, smiling out of the bow window of a club, or taking off his hat to me from the top of an omnibus. I tell you, you can say what you like. That fellow has sold himself to the devil. He can be in 6 places at once." "So you set the Marquis off, I understand," said the professor. "Was it long ago? Shall we be in time to catch him?" "Yes," answered the new guide. "I timed it all. He'll still be at Calais when we arrive." "But when we do catch him at Calais," said the professor, "what are we going to do?" At this question the countenance of Dr. Bull fell for the first time. He reflected a little and then said, "Theoretically, I suppose we ought to call the police." "Not I," said Syme. "Theoretically, I ought to drown myself first. I promised a poor fellow who is a real modern pessimist on my word of honor not to tell the police. I'm no hand at casuistry, but I can't break my word to a modern pessimist. It's like breaking one's word to a child." "I'm in the same boat," said the professor. "I tried to tell the police and couldn't because of some silly oath I took. You see, when I was an actor, I was a sort of all-round beast. Perjury or treason is the only crime I haven't committed. If I did that, I shouldn't know the difference between right and wrong." "I've been through all that," said Dr. Bull, "and I've made up my mind. I gave my promise to the secretary. You know, him, the man who smiles upside down. My friends, that man is the most utterly unhappy man that was ever human. It may be his digestion, or his conscience, or his nerves, or his philosophy of the universe, but he's damned. He's in hell. Well, I can't turn on a man like that and hunt him down. It's like whipping a leper. I may be mad, but that's how I feel, and that's jolly well the end of it." "I don't think you're mad," said Syme. "I knew you would decide like that when first you, "Eh?" said Dr. Bull. "When first you took off your spectacles." Dr. Bull smiled a little and strolled across the deck to look at the sunlit sea. Then he strolled back again, kicking his heels carelessly, and a companionable silence fell between the 3 men. "Well," said Syme, "it seems that we have all got the same kind of morality or immorality, so we had better face the fact that comes of it." "Yes," assented the professor, "you're quite right, and we must hurry up, for I can see the grey nose standing out from France." "The fact that comes of it," said Syme seriously, "is this, that we 3 are alone on this planet. Gogol has gone, God knows where. Perhaps the President has smashed him like a fly. On the council we are 3 men against 3, like the Romans who held the bridge. But we are worse off than that. First, because they can appeal to their organization and we cannot appeal to ours. And second, because one of those other 3 men," said the professor, "is not a man." Syme nodded and was silent for a second or 2. Then he said, "My idea is this. We must do something to keep the Marquis in Calais till tomorrow midday. I have turned over 20 schemes in my head. We cannot denounce him as a dynamiter, that is agreed. We cannot get him detained on some trivial charge, for we should have to appear. He knows us, and he would smell a rat. We cannot pretend to keep him on anarchist business. He might swallow much in that way, but not the notion of stopping in Calais while the Tsar went safely through Paris. We might try to kidnap him and lock him up ourselves, but he is a well-known man here. He has a whole bodyguard of friends. He is very strong and brave, and the event is doubtful. The only thing I can see to do is actually to take advantage of the very things that are in the Marquis's favor. I am going to profit by the fact that he is a highly respected nobleman. I am going to profit by the fact that he has many friends and moves in the best society." "What the devil are you talking about?" asked the professor. "The Symes are first mentioned in the 14th century," said Syme, "but there is a tradition that one of them rode behind Bruce at Bannockburn. Since 1350 the tree is quite clear." "He's gone off his head," said the little doctor, staring. "Our bearings," continued Syme calmly, "are argent, a chevron jewels, charged with 3 crosslets of the field. The motto varies." The professor seized Syme roughly by the waistcoat. "We are just inshore. Are you seasick or joking in the wrong place?" "My remarks are almost painfully practical," answered Syme in an unhurried manner. "The house of Saint-Eustache is also very ancient. The Marquis cannot deny that he is a gentleman. He cannot deny that I am a gentleman. And in order to put the matter of my social position quite beyond a doubt, I propose at the earliest opportunity to knock his hat off. But here we are in the harbor." They went on shore under the strong sun in a sort of daze. Syme, who had now taken the lead as Bull had taken it in London, led them along a kind of marine parade until he came to some cafes, embowered in a bulk of greenery and overlooking the sea. As he went before them, his step was slightly swaggering, and he swung his stick like a sword. He was making apparently for the extreme end of the line of cafes, but he stopped abruptly. With a sharp gesture he motioned them to silence, but he pointed with one gloved finger at a cafe table under a bank of flowering foliage, at which sat the Marquis de Saint-Eustache, his teeth shining in his thick black beard, and his brown, bold face shadowed by a light yellow straw hat and outlined against the violet sea. Chapter 10. The Duel. Syme sat down at a cafe table with his companions, his blue eyes sparkling like the bright sea below, and ordered a bottle of Saumur with a pleased impatience. He was, for some reason, in a condition of curious hilarity. His spirits were already unnaturally high. They rose as the Saumur sank, and in half an hour his talk was a torrent of nonsense. He professed to be making out a plan for the conversation that was going to ensue between himself and the deadly Marquis. He jotted it down wildly with a pencil. It was arranged like a printed catechism, with questions and answers, and was delivered with an extraordinary rapidity of utterance. "I shall approach. Before taking off his hat, I shall take off my own. I shall say, 'The Marquis de Saint-Eustache, I believe.' He will say, 'The celebrated Mr. Syme, I presume.' He will say in the most exquisite French, 'How are you?' And I shall reply in the most exquisite Cockney, 'Oh, just the Syme.'" "Oh, shut it," said the man in spectacles. "Pull yourself together and chuck away that bit of paper. What are you really going to do?" "But it was a lovely catechism," said Syme pathetically. "Do let me read it to you. It has only 43 questions and answers, and some of the Marquis's answers are wonderfully witty. I like to be just to my enemy." "But what's the good of it all?" asked Dr. Bull in exasperation. "It leads up to my challenge, don't you see?" said Syme, beaming. "When the Marquis has given the 39th reply, which runs—" "Has it by any chance occurred to you," asked the professor with a ponderous simplicity, "that the Marquis may not say all the 43 things you have put down for him? In that case, I understand, your own epigrams may appear somewhat forced." Syme struck the table with a radiant face. "Why, how true that is," he said. "I never thought of it. Sir, you have an intellect beyond the common. You will make a name." "Oh, you're drunk as an owl," said the doctor. "It only remains," continued Syme, quite unperturbed, "to adopt some other method of breaking the ice, if I may so express it, between myself and the man I wish to kill. Since the course of a dialogue cannot be predicted by one of its parties alone, as you have pointed out with such recondite acumen, the only thing to be done, I suppose, is for the one party, as far as possible, to do all the dialogue by himself. And so I will, by George." And he stood up suddenly, his yellow hair blowing in the slight sea breeze. A band was playing in a café chantant hidden somewhere among the trees, and a woman had just stopped singing. On Syme's heated head the bray of the brass band seemed like the jar and jingle of that barrel organ in Leicester Square, to the tune of which he had once stood up to die. He looked across to the little table where the Marquis sat. The man had two companions now, solemn Frenchmen in frock coats and silk hats, one of them with the red rosette of the Legion of Honor, evidently people of a solid social position. Beside these black cylindrical costumes, the Marquis, in his loose straw hat and light spring clothes, looked bohemian, even barbaric. But he looked the Marquis. Indeed, one might say he looked the king, with his animal elegance, his scornful eyes, and his proud head lifted against the purple sea. But he was no Christian king, at any rate. He was rather some swarthy despot, half Greek, half Asiatic, who, in the days when slavery seemed natural, looked down on the Mediterranean, on his galley and his groaning slaves. Just so, Syme thought, would the brown-gold face of such a tyrant have shone against the dark green olives and the burning blue. "Are you going to address the meeting?" asked the professor peevishly, seeing that Syme stood up without moving. Syme drained his last glass of sparkling wine. "I am," he said, pointing across to the Marquis and his companions. "That meeting. That meeting displeases me. I am going to pull that meeting's great, ugly, mahogany-colored nose." He stepped across swiftly, if not quite steadily. The Marquis, seeing him, arched his black Assyrian eyebrows in surprise, but smiled politely. "You are Mr. Syme, I think," he said. Syme bowed. "And you are the Marquis de Saint-Eustache," he said gracefully. "Permit me to pull your nose." He leant over to do so, but the Marquis started backwards, upsetting his chair, and the two men in top hats held Syme back by the shoulders. "This man has insulted me," said Syme, with gestures of explanation. "Insulted you?" cried the gentleman with the red rosette. "When?" "Oh, just now," said Syme recklessly. "He insulted my mother." "Insulted your mother?" exclaimed the gentleman incredulously. "Well, anyhow," said Syme, conceding a point, "my aunt." "But how can the Marquis have insulted your aunt just now?" said the second gentleman with some legitimate wonder. "He has been sitting here all the time." "Ah, it was what he said," said Syme darkly. "I said nothing at all," said the Marquis, "except something about the band. I only said that I liked Wagner played well." "It was an allusion to my family," said Syme firmly. "My aunt played Wagner badly. It was a painful subject. We are always being insulted about it." "This seems most extraordinary," said the gentleman who was décoré, looking doubtfully at the Marquis. "Oh, I assure you," said Syme earnestly, "the whole of your conversation was simply packed with sinister allusions to my aunt's weaknesses." "This is nonsense," said the second gentleman. "I, for one, have said nothing for half an hour, except that I like the singing of that girl with the black hair." "Well, there you are again," said Syme indignantly. "My aunt's was red." "It seems to me," said the other, "that you are simply seeking a pretext to insult the Marquis." "By George," said Syme, facing round and looking at him, "what a clever chap you are." The Marquis started up with eyes flaming like a tiger's. "Seeking a quarrel with me? Seeking a fight with me? By God, there has never been a man who had to seek long. These gentlemen will perhaps act for me. There are still 4 hours of daylight. Let us fight this evening." Syme bowed with a quite beautiful graciousness. "Marquis," he said, "your action is worthy of your fame and blood. Permit me to consult for a moment with the gentleman in whose hands I shall place myself." In 3 long strides he rejoined his companions, and they, who had seen his champagne-inspired attack and listened to his idiotic explanations, were quite startled at the look of him. For now that he came back to them, he was quite sober, a little pale, and he spoke in a low voice of passionate practicality. "I have done it," he said hoarsely. "I have fixed a fight on the beast. But look here and listen carefully. There is no time for talk. You are my seconds, and everything must come from you. Now you must insist, and insist absolutely, on the duel coming off after 7 tomorrow, so as to give me the chance of preventing him from catching the 7:45 for Paris. If he misses that, he misses his crime. He can't refuse to meet you on such a small point of time and place. But this is what he will do. He will choose a field somewhere near a wayside station where he can pick up the train. He is a very good swordsman, and he will trust to killing me in time to catch it. But I can fence well, too, and I think I can keep him in play at any rate until the train is lost. Then perhaps he may kill me to console his feelings. You understand? Very well, then. Let me introduce you to some charming friends of mine." And leading them quickly across the parade, he presented them to the Marquis's seconds by 2 very aristocratic names of which they had not previously heard. Syme was subject to spasms of singular common sense, not otherwise a part of his character. They were, as he said of his impulse about the spectacles, poetic intuitions, and they sometimes rose to the exaltation of prophecy. He had correctly calculated in this case the policy of his opponent. When the Marquis was informed by his seconds that Syme could only fight in the morning, he must fully have realized that an obstacle had suddenly arisen between him and his bomb-throwing business in the capital. Naturally, he could not explain this objection to his friends, so he chose the course which Syme had predicted. He induced his seconds to settle on a small meadow not far from the railway, and he trusted to the fatality of the first engagement. When he came down very coolly to the field of honor, no one could have guessed that he had any anxiety about a journey. His hands were in his pockets, his straw hat on the back of his head, his handsome face brazen in the sun. But it might have struck a stranger as odd that there appeared in his train not only his seconds carrying the sword case, but two of his servants carrying a portmanteau and a luncheon basket. Early as was the hour, the sun soaked everything in warmth, and Syme was vaguely surprised to see so many spring flowers burning gold and silver in the tall grass in which the whole company stood almost knee-deep. With the exception of the Marquis, all the men were in somber and solemn morning dress, with hats like black chimney-pots. The little doctor especially, with the addition of his black spectacles, looked like an undertaker in a farce. Syme could not help feeling a comic contrast between this funereal church parade of apparel and the rich and glistening meadow, growing wildflowers everywhere. But indeed this comic contrast between the yellow blossoms and the black hats was but a symbol of the tragic contrast between the yellow blossoms and the black business. On his right was a little wood. Far away to his left lay the long curve of the railway line, which he was, so to speak, guarding from the Marquis, whose goal and escape it was. In front of him, behind the black group of his opponents, he could see, like a tinted cloud, a small almond bush in flower against the faint line of the sea. The member of the Legion of Honor, whose name it seemed was Colonel Ducroix, approached the professor and Dr. Bull with great politeness and suggested that the play should terminate with the first considerable hurt. Dr. Bull, however, having been carefully coached by Syme upon this point of policy, insisted with great dignity and in very bad French that it should continue until one of the combatants was disabled. Syme had made up his mind that he could avoid disabling the Marquis and prevent the Marquis from disabling him for at least 20 minutes. In 20 minutes, the Paris train would have gone by. "To a man of the well-known skill and valor of Monsieur de Saint-Eustache," said the professor solemnly, "it must be a matter of indifference which method is adopted, and our principal has strong reasons for demanding the longer encounter, reasons the delicacy of which prevent me from being explicit, but for the just and honorable nature of which I can—" "Peste!" broke from the Marquis behind, whose face had suddenly darkened. "Let us stop talking and begin." And he slashed off the head of a tall flower with his stick. Syme understood his rude impatience and instinctively looked over his shoulder to see whether the train was coming in sight, but there was no smoke on the horizon. Colonel Ducroix knelt down and unlocked the case, taking out a pair of twin swords, which took the sunlight and turned to two streaks of white fire. He offered one to the Marquis, who snatched it without ceremony, and another to Syme, who took it, bent it, and poised it with as much delay as was consistent with dignity. Then the colonel took out another pair of blades, and taking one himself and giving another to Dr. Bull, proceeded to place the men. Both combatants had thrown off their coats and waistcoats and stood sword in hand. The seconds stood on each side of the line of fight with swords drawn also, but still somber in their dark frock coats and hats. The principals saluted. The colonel said quietly, "Engage," and the two blades touched and tingled. When the jar of the joined iron ran up Syme's arm, all the fantastic fears that had been the subject of this story fell from him like dreams from a man waking up in bed. He remembered them clearly and in order as mere delusions of the nerves. How the fear of the professor had been the fear of the tyrannic accidents of nightmare, and how the fear of the doctor had been the fear of the airless vacuum of science. The first was the old fear that any miracle might happen, and the second, the more hopeless modern fear that no miracle can ever happen. But he saw that these fears were fancies, for he found himself in the presence of the great fact of the fear of death, with its coarse and pitiless common sense. He felt like a man who has dreamed all night of falling over precipices, and had woken up on the morning when he was to be hanged. For as soon as he had seen the sunlight run down the channel of his foe's foreshortened blade, and as soon as he had felt the two tongues of steel touch, vibrating like two living things, he knew that his enemy was a terrible fighter, and that probably his last hour had come. He felt a strange and vivid value in all the earth around him, in the grass under his feet. He felt the love of life in all living things. He could almost fancy he heard the grass growing. He could almost fancy that even as he stood, fresh flowers were springing up and breaking into blossom in the meadow. Flowers blood red and burning gold and blue fulfilled the whole pageant of the spring. And whenever his eyes strayed for a flash from the calm, staring, hypnotic eyes of the Marquis, they saw the little tuft of almond tree against the skyline. He had the feeling that if by some miracle he escaped, he would be ready to sit forever before that almond tree, desiring nothing else in the world. But while earth and sky and everything had the living beauty of a thing lost, the other half of his head was as clear as glass, and he was parrying his enemy's point with a kind of clockwork skill of which he had hardly supposed himself capable. Once his enemy's point ran along his wrist, leaving a slight streak of blood, but it either was not noticed or was tacitly ignored. Every now and then he riposted, and once or twice he could almost fancy he felt his point go home, but as there was no blood on blade or shirt, he supposed he was mistaken. Then came an interruption and a change. At the risk of losing all, the Marquis, interrupting his quiet stare, flashed one glance over his shoulder at the line of railway on his right. Then he turned on Syme a face transfigured to that of a fiend, and began to fight as if with 20 weapons. The attack came so fast and furious that the one shining sword seemed a shower of shining arrows. Syme had no chance to look at the railway, but also he had no need. He could guess the reason of the Marquis's sudden madness of battle. The Paris train was in sight. But the Marquis's morbid energy overreached itself. Twice, Syme, parrying, knocked his opponent's point far out of the fighting circle, and the third time his riposte was so rapid there was no doubt about the hit this time. Syme's sword actually bent under the weight of the Marquis's body, which it had pierced. Syme was as certain that he had stuck his blade into his enemy as a gardener that he had stuck his spade into the ground. Yet the Marquis sprang back from the stroke without a stagger, and Syme stood staring at his own sword point like an idiot. There was no blood on it at all. There was an instant of rigid silence, and then Syme, in his turn, fell furiously on the other, filled with a flaming curiosity. The Marquis was probably, in a general sense, a better fencer than he, as he had surmised at the beginning, but at the moment the Marquis seemed distraught and at a disadvantage. He fought wildly and even weakly, and he constantly looked away at the railway line, almost as if he feared the train more than the pointed steel. Syme, on the other hand, fought fiercely but still carefully, in an intellectual fury, eager to solve the riddle of his own bloodless sword. For this purpose he aimed less at the Marquis's body and more at his throat and head. A minute and a half afterward he felt his point enter the man's neck below the jaw. It came out clean. Half mad, he thrust again and made what should have been a bloody scar on the Marquis's cheek. But there was no scar. For one moment the heaven of Syme again grew black with supernatural terrors. Surely the man had a charmed life. But this new spiritual dread was a more awful thing than had been the mere spiritual topsy-turvydom symbolized by the paralytic who pursued him. The professor was only a goblin. This man was a devil. Perhaps he was the devil. Anyhow, this was certain, that 3 times had a human sword been driven into him and made no mark. When Syme had that thought, he drew himself up, and all that was good in him sang high up in the air as a high wind sings in the trees. He thought of all the human things in his story, of the Chinese lanterns in Saffron Park, of the girl's red hair in the garden, of the honest beer-swilling sailors down by the dock, of his loyal companions standing by. Perhaps he had been chosen as a champion of all these fresh and kindly things to cross swords with the enemy of all creation. After all, he said to himself, I am more than a devil, I am a man. I can do the one thing which Satan himself cannot do. I can die. And as the word went through his head, he heard a faint and far-off hoot, which would soon be the roar of the Paris train. He fell to fighting again with a supernatural levity, like a Mohammedan panting for paradise. As the train came nearer and nearer, he fancied he could see people putting up the floral arches in Paris. He joined in the growing noise and the glory of the great republic whose gate he was guarding against hell. His thoughts rose higher and higher with the rising roar of the train, which ended, as if proudly, in a long and piercing whistle. The train stopped. Suddenly, to the astonishment of everyone, the Marquis sprang back quite out of sword reach and threw down his sword. The leap was wonderful, and not less wonderful because Syme had plunged his sword a moment before into the man's thigh. "Stop," said the Marquis in a voice that compelled a momentary obedience. "I want to say something." "What is the matter?" asked Colonel Ducroix, staring. "Has there been foul play?" "There's been foul play somewhere," said Dr. Bull, who was a little pale. "Our principal has wounded the Marquis 4 times at least, and he is none the worse." The Marquis put up his hand with a curious air of ghastly impatience. "Please let me speak. It is rather important. Mr. Syme," he continued, turning to his opponent, "we are fighting today, if I remember right, because you expressed a wish, which I thought irrational, to pull my nose. Would you oblige me by pulling my nose now as quickly as possible? I have a train to catch." "I protest that this is most irregular," said Dr. Bull indignantly. "It is certainly somewhat opposed to precedent," said Colonel Ducroix, looking wistfully at his principal. "There is, I think, one case on record, Captain Bellegarde and the Baron Zumpf, in which the weapons were changed in the middle of the encounter at the request of one of the combatants, but one can hardly call one's nose a weapon." "Will you or will you not pull my nose?" said the Marquis in exasperation. "Come, Mr. Syme, you wanted to do it. Do it. You can have no conception of how important it is to me. Don't be so selfish. Pull my nose at once when I ask you." And he bent slightly forward with a fascinating smile. The Paris train, panting and groaning, had grated into a little station behind the neighboring hill. Syme had the feeling he had more than once had in these adventures, the sense that a horrible and sublime wave lifted to heaven and was just toppling over. Walking in a world he half understood, he took 2 paces forward and seized the Roman nose of his remarkable nobleman. He pulled it hard, and it came off in his hand. We'll find out more about the Marquis next time.